Perfect. So it looks like everyone's filtering in here. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Mike Seema, and I'm a senior admissions counselor in the graduate admissions office that works very closely with the graduate business programs. I'm happy to have our panelists here with us this afternoon to discuss a little bit more about the state of the Western New York economy. And I'm going to turn it over now to Laura McEwen, our Associate Dean and Director of Graduate Business Programs, to kick things off and introduce our panelists.
Thank you. On behalf of the Masters of Business Alumni Association, I welcome you to the State of the Western New York Economy. And I would like the panel, if they could just take a few seconds and introduce themselves, and we will start with Dr. Zaporowski.
Sure. Hi, I'm Mark Zaporowski. I am Professor of Economics and Finance and Chair of the Economics Finance Department.
I'm Juliana Golbieski. I'm Associate Professor of Economics and Finance.
I'm George Palumbo. I'm Professor Emeritus in the Department of Economics and Finance. Emeritus is a fancy way of saying retired. Okay, I'm going to start with an overview of how we're going to approach this. This is our third webinar since the beginning of COVID. We did one in May of 2020, which was just the bottom of our economy and the top of our fears. We did one in June of 2021 where we speculated about how quickly we were going to recover and what was happening, and now we're doing one today. Most of the data you see here, most of the charts you will see appear in the Western New York Economic Newsletter. The three of us produce the newsletter 3 times a year. Our next one will be at the end of this month. If you don't already get the newsletter, just send us a note through the chat and we will make sure you get one in May. In January of 2020, I heard Dr. Zaporowski talking to 2 students, both of whom I knew, and he said that the underlying fundamentals of the economy in the United States were very good, and he could not see any recession coming unless there was an exogenous shock. And I was standing right next to him and I said, wow, that was really interesting. I didn't say it. I thought, that was really interesting. That was a good way to put it. And I started to think about what kinds of exogenous shocks I'd lived through. The 2001 dot-com then World Trade Center recession, the 2008 market, financial markets calamity. Never could I have thought that we were going to see all 4 horsemen of the apocalypse in the next 2 years. So I think Mark is going to start now to look at our macro overview of what has happened and what is happening now. And I'll let him talk.
Okay, we always start, talking when we're interested in doing some regional analysis, what's going on in Western New York, to talk about the U.S. economy as a whole, because it really mirrors our local economy, mirrors sort of what's going on in the nation. And really the big issues in macro right now is, has the economy entered a recession already, or will it enter a recession? Will the Federal Reserve be forced to send interest rates much higher to slow the economy and bring down inflation should inflation continue to accelerate? So, what you see on your screen is real GDP in the US, again, measured in billions of 2012 dollars. You see the V-shaped recession that we had. That was the COVID recession. Real GDP peaked in 2019, fourth quarter, and then 2020, first and second quarter, we had declines in real GDP, and very large magnitude drop in comparison to what's gone on in the past. It can go back to the Great Depression of the 1930s to talk about the magnitude of the decline. But the recession didn't last long. We went back to our growth path. And, basically a fairly steady recovery from that recession from the third quarter of 2020 through the fourth quarter of 2021. But we see the first quarter, actually the first estimate of real GDP in the first quarter of 2022 shows the economy declining by 1.4%. In real terms. And so, the question is, well, what has caused that decline? And really, if you look at the data, it was a decline in inventories, in government spending, in exports, and a rise in imports. When imports rise, that reduces GDP. Personal consumption expenditures, though, did increase by 0.7%. And, I guess consumers' balance sheets right now look pretty good because of all the, the government expenditures and so on, various benefits that have been given. I know savings rates are relatively high, and, what consumers do, that accounts for about 70% of GDP on average. Oops, too much. There we go. So here's just the quarter by quarter. These are, percentage changes from the previous quarter. And, you can see the very large decline, over 31% in second quarter of 2020, and followed by a big increase. And then fairly steady growth again until the recent data has come out. So really, the question is becoming, are we going to return to positive growth in the second quarter of this year, or are we in recession? The other big issue has been the very large increase in acceleration of inflation. In this chart, we show inflation rates, 12-month percentage changes in both the CPI, Consumer Price Index, and also the personal consumption expenditure deflator for GDP. That's the black line on the chart. That is the Federal Reserve's preferred measure of inflation. Inflation began to accelerate mid-year 2020. And a lot of that was related to supply chain issues as a result of COVID. But we feel it's also the two other things responsible for the acceleration would be overly aggressive monetary policy and also overly aggressive fiscal policy. The Federal Reserve initially thought that inflation was a transitory phenomenon, it was going to go away. But looking at this data, it doesn't appear that they were correct. From March 2021 to March 2022, that would be on the, where are we here? There's the mouse, from here and here on both indices. CPI is increased 8.54%, and the personal consumption expenditure deflator increased by 6.6%. And this sort of reminds me of when I was in graduate school, and one of my favorite economists was Milton Friedman, and Milt said, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. So I want to go and take a look at, let's say, what the Fed has done. Here we've got two things. We've got the monetary base. The monetary base is currency in circulation plus reserves. And then we've got the M2 money supply that's shown on the right axis. The blue line is the monetary base shown on the left axis. And what's important here is if we just look at where the acceleration in the monetary base started. okay? And it was a pretty dramatic increase where, I think a lot of this had to do with the Fed monetizing the national debt because the government has spent so much, to fight the COVID recession, and the Fed was accommodative in terms of buying securities, treasury securities, and also mortgage-backed securities. If you compare, let's say, February of 2020, when the acceleration in the monetary base started, the Fed was holding 2.5 trillion of treasury securities on their balance sheet and 1.4 trillion of mortgage-backed securities on their balance sheet. In April, the latest data that's out there from the end of April shows that treasury securities now are 5.8 trillion on the Fed's balance sheet, and mortgage securities 2.7 trillion. So that's been roughly a doubling of, in really a 2-year period of those securities, and those are things that lead to and support, let's say, the monetary base increasing so rapidly. Now, the Fed FOMC, Federal Open Market Committee, is meeting yesterday and today they're going to announce, what they plan to do. It's widely expected that there's going to be a 50 basis point increase in the federal funds rate target. And I think the plan is also to let about $60 billion of treasury securities run off the Fed balance sheet, and about $35 billion per month of mortgage-backed securities running off the balance sheet. Okay. This chart kind of shows inflation, and here we focused on the CPI, and this is March over March changes from the previous year. On the bottom of the graph, you see the weights of each category. We picked a few categories: food and beverages, housing, motor vehicles, gasoline, energy in general, and then all items less energy. You see food and beverages, that accounts for roughly 14% of consumer market basket expenditures. And you see the rapid increase, let's say 2020 to 2021, about 3.4% increase in food and beverages. And, that's gone up March 2022 from 2021, almost 8.5%, as probably most of you recognize. You're going shopping in the supermarkets, you see the fairly large increases that have occurred in the price of items that you buy there. Housing has the biggest weight in the consumer market basket, and that's been pretty steady. That's accelerated a bit in the recent period to about 6.4%. Big increase in motor vehicles, and it's 21.5% increase in motor vehicle prices in general. Big increases in the price of gasoline. That's gone up 48% in the most recent time period. Energy in general, is exhibited, let's say, less of an increase compared to gasoline, but still up fairly large amount, 32%. Oops, too far.
I got it.
I'm gonna go up to the first. There we go. Two things we look at here, WTI, which is the price per barrel of crude oil, West Texas Intermediate crude oil. And here we've got the nominal prices, and you see from 1990 on, this is end of month data. And oil prices were hovering around $20 a barrel through 2002. We had a fairly large increase prior to the financial market meltdown and the 2008-2009 recession, and then a big drop during that recessionary period. And then again, climbing oil prices to around $100 a barrel. Again, a big drop in about 2014, 2015. But then we had, a fairly large run up recently. The most recent data here is in March 2022, when the price of crude was about $108 per barrel. That's up from May 2020, when it was $16.55 a barrel. Another thing that we noticed was, if looking at things in the past, if you've read Western New York Economic News, we found that if you looked at the real price per barrel of crude, usually that spikes prior to recessions. And, so then the question is, if we look at, again, the most recent time period that we have here, we've had a spike in real terms. This is, everything's measured here in January 2022 dollars. But we're still, in real terms, the price of crude in 2022 dollars in March of this year is still less than it was back in 2007, 2008. Where it was July 2008 was $133 a barrel, again, in real terms. So we're still below our peak, even though in nominal terms, gas prices and so on seem relatively high, and so does the price of oil. Next thing we want to go to is to take a look at labor market. Before I turn things over to my colleague Juliana, we just want to look here. We've got U.S. payroll employment in red, Western New York payroll employment in the black line. You see that the drop that occurred was pretty much coincident between the U.S. and Western New York. The peak was in February of 2020, again, focusing on the more recent time period. There's the peak that coincides both Western New York and the nation as a whole. Then we get the big drop as a result of the COVID recession and people being thrown out of work. The drop in the US from peak to the trough was in April of 2020, down here, was 14.4% for the US, but Western New York drop was greater in percentage terms, almost 22%, 21.9%. But then we have the rise after that, right? Going from trough, to the next peak. And if we just view that as, again, the latest data that we have is March 2022, the US payroll employment is up 15.6%. Western New York employment is up 21.2% from trough to peak. But the US is still about 1% below its February 2020 peak in employment. But Western New York were 5.3% below our pre-recession peak. So it's the sort of the typical refrain here that those of you who have followed our newsletter, we drop more and haven't recovered as fully. And that's been the case over the several business cycles where we've been following, that have occurred where we've been following this data. So I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Juliana.
Okay. So on the screen right now, you see the US unemployment rate. And the unemployment rate is a percentage of the labor force. So typically we would look at the unemployment rate to see the fraction of the labor force that was not employed, but actively searching for work as a measure of economic conditions. So you can see here, March 2022, we were near the pre-COVID level of unemployment rate. Unfortunately, the unemployment rate isn't as good a measure of underlying economic conditions. Why? Because particularly over the last 25 months, we've seen a lot of movement in the labor force. So on the screen right now, we have US labor force participation rates. In February 2020, the labor force participation rate was right at 63.4%. And you could see as the COVID caused our lockdown, we had a dramatic decrease. Part of that was just the definition of how we define the labor force. So individuals who were furloughed during the initial lockdown didn't necessarily appear in the labor force because they considered themselves to have a job. They just weren't working, nor were they looking for work. So you could see part of that initial climb as the economy reopened was a result of that. Then in 2021, we saw some recovery, but you could see here in 2021, we really indicated a steady, somewhat steady labor force participation between 61.5% and 61.8%. So during that year, we were a little bit concerned that the labor force wasn't recovering as fully as we had expected. But then you can see in the last 3 months, as we moved from the end of 2021 into 2022, we have the labor force participation rate increasing by 0.5 percentage point. So that is more promising. Unfortunately, though, you can see that even though we are recovering, we're still more than a percentage point below where we were, where we started the lockdown. And that we don't necessarily expect to recover fully. But to understand that in greater detail, we have the US labor force participation rates by age and gender. So on the left-hand side here, we have different age groups. And then for each year in the first quarter, we have males versus females. And you can see the youngest age group, 16 to 19. We have some interesting variation here. So in 2019 first quarter, the male labor force participation rate was 31.5%. That has since increased. Our latest quarter that we just finished, the male labor force participation rate has increased to 33.7%. We also saw an increase amongst the females as well, but to a lesser extent. Now, that's interesting because that age group is typically not counted among the labor force in non-summer months because they are typically full-time students. So this may indicate there is a difference in the propensity to stay in school. So that's interesting. We also see amongst those aged 25 to 34 and 35 to 44, the male labor force participation rates have decreased. However, amongst the females, they have increased in approximately the same magnitude. So that is interesting, and it may indicate a change for the labor market as we see it going forward. Now, this age group 45 to 54, we see a decrease amongst both the males and the females as we compare 2019 to 2022. And that I had initially thought was an indicator of perhaps early retirement. And that could still be the reason, but it is the age group that is recovering less fully and less quickly than the others. And then finally, if we look at those age 65 plus, so these two groups here, we saw a slight uptick in the males in the 65 to 69 age range, but the decrease amongst the females was substantial. And then amongst the 70 plus, we saw a decrease in both. So that I think is part of what we can expect going forward. Those in the older age groups stay out of the labor force, and perhaps we're going to look at those younger to make up the gap. Here we see the labor force in the Buffalo MSA. So the blue grouping are those who are unemployed. The yellow is the employed residents. So you can see the same phenomena that we just spoke about in the last 3 months at the US level. We also saw an increase amongst those in the labor force over the last 3 months locally, which is obviously a promising sign. And where we were concerned last year with the unemployment rate continuously decreasing, but decreasing because the labor force was decreasing. Now we're seeing a little bit of an uptick in the unemployment rate, but again, because we are seeing more people either actively searching for work or employed themselves. Now, this is the payroll employment. Dr. Zaborowski talked about how we were still 5% down from where we were pre-pandemic. That amounts to about 30,000 jobs. Now, there are some interesting industries that I'd like to draw your attention to. Firstly, in construction. We started in March 2019 here, we had 18,700 jobs. In March 2022, we have 700 more jobs than that. So that is one of our bright spots. That is probably not unexpected to you driving around and seeing new construction happening and home renovations as well. And then in transportation and utilities, that's our other bright spot. We were at 18,700, increasing to 20,900 in this most recent month. That is primarily due to our heavier dependence on ordering things online, for example. Some of our economic expectations are going to rely on changes we see in consumer behavior as a result of the pandemic. Now, that 30,000 drop, we see concentrated in a couple of areas. So health and social assistance, we are still down more than 5,000 jobs. Social assistance includes places like nursing homes and other care facilities. And those typically are on the lower end of the wage spectrum. They also have a little bit less of an ability to increase wages to attract new workers. So we would expect that area to have some difficulty. The other one, though, is interesting. Local government, we're still down 6,200 jobs. And what's interesting about that is they are not concentrated in areas of education, nor are they concentrated in hospitals. So it could be that there were early retirements, or we transitioned from offering services directly to contracting out services, et cetera. The remaining 20,000 jobs are sort of evenly dispersed then amongst the rest of the industries, which indicates perhaps that it is in fact a labor shortage that we are experiencing. So here on this slide, I have payroll employment in yellow, and the blue line is resident employment. Payroll employment is taken from a survey that is sent to employers asking how many people are on payroll. Resident employment is taken from the household survey asking residents whether they're employed. You can see the gap between payroll and resident employment from 2017 through even January 2020 has remained somewhat consistent and large. Then we see as the economy locked down due to the pandemic and came back out, the gap between the two lines have shrunk. We see resident employment almost reaching pre-pandemic levels. We're down about 8,000 individuals. Whereas with the payroll employment, we're down 30,000 jobs. Now, there are a couple of potential reasons for that. Firstly, we have multiple job holders. So where an individual is employed, they count within resident employment. But if they have multiple jobs, they would count multiple times under payroll. So it may be that people are less likely in this environment to take second, or third jobs. Secondly, we have commuters, people who do not live in the Buffalo MSA, but commute in for work. That, understandably, probably went down during the pandemic. For example, the Canadian border being closed and it being more difficult to cross the border to come in for work would reduce payroll employment, whereas it would not affect resident employment. And then the last thing, we have self-employed individuals. Self-employed would show up in resident employment, would not show up in payroll employment. And we have all heard about the propensity for individuals who were working at home to perhaps start their own jobs. That is a potential explanation for what we see in terms of payroll employment falling further than resident employment. And now I'm going to pass it over to George Palumbo.
I'm going to keep this chart up for a moment. When we looked at this, I wondered if part of the change, the difference in the gap and the lower level of employment was due to a change in the number of establishments in the area. As I looked at the data, I discovered I was wrong. It was not the change in the number of establishments that caused it, but I was right. There were some dramatic changes in the number of establishments. So what I'm going to do in the next two charts is look at the Buffalo MSA. MSA is a metropolitan statistical area. I'm going to look at it first in the context of the other upstate New York metropolitan statistical areas, Rochester and Syracuse. I will do some comparisons over time with those. And then I'll look specifically at the Buffalo, in more depth at the Buffalo metropolitan statistical area. Okay. What I did here was I took the payroll data that Juliana was talking about for the three upstate metropolitan areas and the US as a whole, the nation. I divided every year by the employment levels in 2000 so that we start with an index of 1. Everything starts out at 1. The US is in red, Buffalo, Rochester, and Syracuse, black, green, and brown in that order. I like this chart for two reasons. One, it helps us see on one axis the relative changes without having the magnitude of the employment affect anything. And two, I've done this before. While I was preparing for this, I went back to a presentation I'd made to the upstate Catholic bishops in 2001. And I had done the exact same thing back to 1990, and I found the same results. So I could have just changed the dates on it instead of going through the work. All right, let's start by looking at what happened in our first recession. 2001, it started in November of 2000, it went through 2001, it was exacerbated by the events of 9/11, 2001, and you can see every place dropped as compared to the levels in 2000. All of them are below 1, all the values are below 1. You can also see, as Mark alluded to before, the rest of the country recovers a little quicker, a little sooner, it recovers quicker, and it recovers far more fully than the upstate metropolitan areas. So you'll see there's very little difference between Buffalo, Rochester, and Syracuse over that period. In 2007, again, something that Dr. Zaporowski said to me, warned me that we were heading for recession. He said, we're losing employment gains every month in 2007, and in the first 2 months of 2008, they were actually negative. He said, this is bad, and this is going to lead to a recession, which it did. Now, there's the nation. Here are the three upstate areas. There's two things of interest to me in this. As we have said in the newsletter time and time again, we often led the nation into a recession. We did not this time. We trailed slightly. We did keep our role, though, as falling deeper, staying longer, and recovering less fully. So if you look here, the recession is officially ended sometime in 2010. In terms of employment, we take off in the nation, and it's hard to call this a takeoff. We start to grow again in the upstate metropolitan areas, and the gap between the nation and the upstate metro areas it just continues to expand. We're falling behind the rest of the country. The reason we all fell into the recession at the same time was it was not purely an economic recession. This was induced by the reaction to the pandemic. We all fell. There we are at the bottom. Our first, what I said earlier was we gave our first pandemic webinar in May, and I believe monthly data shows that we hit the bottom in April. We hadn't known we'd hit the bottom yet. We still thought we were falling down the stairs, and it hurt. The nation, again, leads us out of the recession, and if you look, the gap continues to grow. Dr. Gobieski said to me, maybe you're just looking at changes in population. You're seeing reflected here changes in the population, which increase the slow down the rate of employment growth, and that's all you're seeing. So I looked at population from 2000 to 2020 in the United States in the three MSAs, and employment to see what happened. Now I got asterisks, an asterisk next to Rochester and Syracuse. An MSA is a statistical area, a metropolitan statistical area. They were established in 1950. They were fully used by 1960. We went through a series of SMSAs, standardized metropolitan statistical areas, CMSAs, consolidated, core-based statistical areas, but they're all statistical areas. Now, what does that mean? In the delineation of what goes into those areas changed. In Rochester, after the 2000 census, they said Batavia and Genesee County were more functionally integrated into the Rochester area and belonged as part of the Rochester MSA. So they added Genesee County. So the rate of change between 2000 and 2010 in Rochester reflects, in the Rochester metropolitan area, reflects the addition of a county. Syracuse, they added Cayuga County. Cayuga County is where Auburn is. After 2010, we moved to core-based statistical areas. None of this really matters to you in the rest of your life, but they took Genesee County out of Rochester. They took Cayuga County out of Syracuse, made them micropolitan areas. So this variation from 2000 to 2020 is a more realistic measure than the variation from 2000 to 2010, and then from 2010 to 2020. All right, so what does it all mean? Yeah, except for the Rochester metropolitan area, we all declined in population. Dr. Gobieski is correct. And again, with no exceptions, the United States gained employment relative to its 2000 employment, and the rest of the metropolitan areas, the upstate metropolitan areas, lost employment compared to their 2000 levels. How much? A fair amount. What time is it? We're getting close. All right, let me go through this pretty quickly. Payroll employment fell in the United States 2.5%, in the Buffalo metropolitan area about 7.7%. I haven't got that yet. Yeah, that's all right. The number of establishments, and this is why I said I learned something, even though it wasn't what I expected to learn, fell by grew by 7.3% in the United States and fell by 0.3% in Western New York. You can see the numbers. I just changed them to percent. It's a lot easier to make some sense of that. And in the Buffalo area, wages changed changed a little bit in a way I had not anticipated. In the third quarter of 2019, average wages per worker in Buffalo were 86% of the national average. And in 2021, the average wage per worker was 88% of the national average. Well, let's look at this in context, historical context. When Mark and I started, we kept comparing Buffalo to the United States, and it was starting to fall from above the national average to the national average. Now, a movement from 86% to 88% of the national average is can be seen as a positive move. What else? The composition of employment between third quarter of 2019 and 2021 might also explain something about the change in the average wage rate. A lot of people lost their jobs. A lot of people kept their jobs. I showed my wife the data yesterday, and she said, how come state employees have a 49% higher average wage now than they did in 2019? And my answer was, I don't want to think about that, but given a second and a glare, I said, most likely because the people who lost their jobs in state employment at UB, at Buff State, and I believe Roswell Park is still reported as state employment, were probably lower wage people, and the people who kept their jobs were higher wage people. And there were a lot of them employed in Western New York. Thanks. All right, so where do we go from here? I made a list of things that we should worry about or that we know, and things that we might want to worry about or be happy about that we know. We know that we have to think about. First, is the pandemic over? I don't know. It certainly has changed. But when I hear over the last 2 weeks that something between 25 million and 350 million people in China have been under lockdown, it makes me think something is going on that I may not fully understand. Second question, we've all heard about supply chain interruptions and the effect on prices. Has the supply chain been mended? I can't answer that question. I don't even know where to start until I know what's actually happening in China. We source a lot of our inputs from China, as well as final goods and services. If they're on the way to a longer term slowdown in economic activity imposed by the Chinese government, then there's no way I can conclude that the supply chain is mended. If they're not, then maybe over the next year we will see some relief. How severe will the current inflation be, and for how long? A lot of that depends on the supply chain issues, the price of things like petroleum, which we know are increasing, the effectiveness of the sanctions, the willingness of other countries to boycott or not use Russian oil during the Ukrainian war. Will affect and continue to affect energy prices. Will the war in Ukraine spread or intensify? I don't know. I don't know how to start answering that question. If it does, I know there will be effects. Will the Fed actions affect the economy? Now, will they? We know they will. How will they affect? Well, Mark has told us what they plan on doing. They have indirect effects. They increase the cost of borrowing for individuals and households and firms and governments. I wonder how high the treasury rate will go. I believe that the national debt is somewhere around 28 trillion right now. A much larger percent of that is held by the Fed than was held 5 years ago. And then what happens if Russians, not just the Russian government, default on dollar-denominated debt, which is something other people are worried about. We don't know what will happen. I do know and remember that much smaller countries defaulted on the debt and threw financial markets into disarray for a while. We had Argentina, we had Venezuela, we had Mexico, if you want to go back to the 90s. What do we know? We know that there is inflation. We know the inflation has increased, and we know that inflation affects people's behavior, household behavior. Mark said the current inflation rate was what, about 8.5, 8.4?
Yeah,
8.4%. He looked up the Michigan survey on consumer sentiment and found that the household expectations in March was about what the inflation rate was, 8.5. How will people's behavior change? If it costs more to buy a house in mortgages, there will be less consumption. I don't know when that'll start. That will happen. If people do not qualify for new car loans, there will be fewer cars. Okay. The petroleum price increase we know has gone up. We've also heard that we're going to move to ethanol 15% instead of 10% by this summer. Currently, 40% of the U.S. corn crop is used to produce ethanol. So 10% ethanol uses 40% of the crop. Does 15% ethanol imply 60% of the corn crop? If it does, it will affect not just the price of corn. It will affect the price of other foodstuffs. It will affect the price of meat. It will happen not just in the United States, but in bordering countries for sure. And eventually throughout the rest of the world, we will see the effects of, one, the inflation, and two, higher petroleum prices, and three, our attempts to get away from them. When will we start to know what the FMOC does? Probably about the time you finish eating lunch, 2 o'clock. Okay, we are ready for questions and happy to give answers. I don't guarantee on my part correct answers, just answers.
Yeah. So we've got a couple of questions that have come through so far, and I'd like to remind everybody too, if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A and we'll make sure they get to the presenters. The first one is from Cameron Tolsma here. Cameron's wondering, is there any indication that increases in remote work opportunities post-COVID have impacted Western New York's job market?
Well, that is another potential explanation of why we see resident employment. It recovered more fully. So where residents are employed, it doesn't necessarily matter where their workplaces are. So they could be working, let's say, in their New York office from their Buffalo home, in which case they count as being a resident that is employed, but they would count on the payroll side in New York City. So that is a potential explanation, and it is one that we know there is going to be a greater desire to work from home now. And with the labor shortages that exist, the employers are going to have to respond to that need from their employees. So I do believe that that is a more lasting effect that we will see in our area in particular, especially given our cost of living relative to the other big cities.
Next question here is from Justin Begley. It's kind of a two-part question. First part, is the labor market in Buffalo considered to be more or less tight compared to other metros like Rochester and Syracuse? If there is a relatively larger imbalance between job openings and that level of employment, is that causing the rather robust wage growth, or are there other mechanisms at play?
I can talk about wage growth in Buffalo. I didn't look yet at Rochester and Syracuse. No, it's not. Okay. I think my honest answer is I don't know. I think we have seen the upstate metropolitan areas move in lockstep in terms of employment, in terms of labor force. I'd be surprised if they did not move in lockstep. I believe the main difference between Buffalo and the other two is that the metropolitan areas were created in terms of journey to work, where people lived and where they worked. In Buffalo, it was always artificially cut off at the Canadian border. One of the reasons the Buffalo metropolitan area never changed its definition is that we never included international areas. We don't go outside the country. So, as I said, I suspect similar things are happening in Rochester and Buffalo. I also suspect that we really don't know everything about Buffalo yet because we don't know the effect of Canadian border crossings.
And the second part to his question here is, do you expect labor market tightness to subside near term?
I do think we will be headed in a direction where there will be there will be fewer firms looking for employees and more employees looking for work. So where we see large increases in inflation in order to maintain a similar basket of goods, employees need to work longer hours, or they may need to take second jobs or third jobs, in which case we will see more employees available. The other thing is where we were talking about potential early retirements. The way that the stock market goes is going to impact how they're going to be able to afford that lifestyle, in which case we may see people re-enter the labor market looking for work.
Our next question comes from Eric McAvoy here. First off, he says, great job. This was very informative. And his question is, what about the Western New York economy causes our labor market to recover slower relative to the US as a whole?
I wish we knew that answer. It's difficult to say. I don't know. What do you think, George, about that?
I was thinking about that this morning. One of the changes that's occurred over time is a dramatic decline in the level of manufacturing employment in Western New York, and manufacturing is a percent of the whole. In 1990, as I said, I went back to look at what I had done in 2001. In 1990, there were 93,000 manufacturing employees. In 2000 and third quarter of 2021, there were 50,000 manufacturing employees in Buffalo. Now, US manufacturing dropped from 18 million to 12 million. So manufacturing was the key to Buffalo market 40 years ago, less so 30 years ago. And my guess is even less so now. Is that why it recovers more slowly? I don't know, but they have happened at the same time. The post-World War II recessions have all been occurring at the same time that we've lost manufacturing jobs. To other places in the country, and now to other places in the world. If we bring back the supply chain into the United States, that could change.
Any last questions? We do have a couple more minutes here. I'm not seeing any right now in the Q&A, but we'll give everybody another minute if anyone does have one last question. If not, we really appreciate the time that Dr. Zaporowski, Dr. Golubieski, and Dr. Palumbo have given us this afternoon and their insightful presentation here. While we're waiting, if there's any last questions, I want to turn it back to our panelists if they have any closing remarks, any final words, and we can get everybody on with the rest of their day.
I have my crack. Done.
Yeah.
We're happy if you're happy. I'll wait if they've got some. We can wait if they want, if there are more questions.
They're all hungry, they want lunch.
They're all hungry for information. They want to look at the,
Hungrier for the more expensive food than they are for the knowledge about the Western.
they want to go find out what's happening. The FOMC meeting.
We do have one that did come in from Reagan here. Do you ever compare Buffalo to other cities in the US?
We have, yes. We have gone through and when the term Rust Belt became commonly used, and that all started in the academic world with the 80 to 82 recession. There were two in there, but unless you lived in the Great Lakes. We went through and showed the relative rates of recovery from the recessions for Buffalo compared to the other like cities that were heavily manufacturing at the beginning of the term. That's why I came back to manufacturing. We lost manufacturing employment from Buffalo to Cleveland early on. We lost manufacturing employment from Cleveland and Detroit, but growth in Milwaukee, which is hardly what you'd call a rust bucket city, but it's a Great Lakes city. And Chicago was more vibrant. So yes, we have. I have not done it recently, but there was a big change. And part of the lost manufacturing employment was closing down facilities here, relocating in Cleveland or Detroit or in the South or now
In the West.
in the West, outside the country.
Well, it looks like that's all the questions we have that have come through. There's a couple people that have been asked to be added to the newsletter, so I'll make sure you get their contact information as well. And again, I want to thank you for your time this afternoon, and we really appreciate all the work you put into this and always sharing with us this information. So thank you to our attendees also. If you would like a copy of this webinar, it has been recorded, and we'd be happy to send it out. And again, enjoy the rest of the afternoon, and thank you again to our presenters.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Mike.
Thank you.
Thank you for the help. Thank you, Laura, for setting it up.